The second group of materials found in these environmental samples is unidentifiable fibers. And I really want you to appreciate the meaning of unidentifiable. These fibers have been sent to sophisticated laboratories, and there is nothing in the databases that match them. So these are fibers, we could say, that do not exist in nature. People around the world are developing lesions on their skin that ooze and produce fibers. This is known as Morgellons syndrome. Tissue samples cultured from ordinary people without this ailment contain and grow the very same fibers. Here's a 5-inch lesion on a woman's body that has never healed, 5 inches. The fibers or filaments are actually tubules with hollow insides. When these fibers are cultured, they produce colonies of filaments. You can see the extension filaments. And these colonies continue to grow and reproduce, branching out into more filaments and more colonies. The filament cultures can be grown from saliva samples, tissue from the skin, mucus, urine, blood, from animals and people, regardless of the presence of the Morgellons condition. The fibers are segmented with visible structures inside them. So where do these fibers or filaments come from? Airborne environmental samples that were collected by Clifford Carnicom, he is a researcher in this subject, in 2000, the year 2000, gathered at high altitude on a mountain in New Mexico, showed the presence of those fibers whose structure matches exactly the tubular filaments. When I say fibers and filaments, basically interchangeable, showing up in our blood, tissues, and skin. Additionally, the samples collected by Mr. Carnicom showed what he calls, and was called in biology, desiccated erythrocytes. This is a multisyllabic term, but it means dried red blood cells. So, why these were in the air? Why are dried red blood cells in the air? Very puzzling. A medical microscopist, a biologist specializing in microscopy, confirmed to him that they were human red blood cells, but that they had been engineered in some way so as to be preserved. So again, you have to ask yourself, if I were 5 years old, I would say, Mommy, what are red blood cells doing falling out of the sky? Biology divides life into 3 kingdoms: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Bacteria and archaea are simple organisms with no subcellular compartments. Eukarya are complex with defined cell compartments and internal organelles, mini organs like mitochondria that make DNA and energy for the cell. Plants, animals, and humans are eukaryotic, as are fungi and slime molds. The archaea are the hardiest of the life forms. They're able to withstand grinding pressure, heat, acidity, and alkalinity. They can live in volcanoes, geysers, and the ice shelf. Bacteria, on the other hand, will die in extreme heat and cold, which is why we cook and freeze our food. Now, the materials appearing within these filaments are as tough as archaea. They look like bacteria, and they self-replicate. One looks like something called mycoplasma, but is not. One looks like chlamydia, but is not. And natural fibers or filaments would be classified as fungal in the domain of eukaryotes. But these fibers contain forms from the other 2 groups inside them. You're looking at a tubular fiber with self-replicating internal elements resembling bacteria and behaving like archaea. That does not happen in the natural world. So what are they? What's going on? It appears that within our bodies we now have all 3 life kingdoms replicating themselves. What does that make us? Are we still eukaryotes, or are we becoming something else? You could call this transbiology, a crossing of biology. the creation of hybrid forms. Materials are forming in our bodies that are not native to us, not natural, and entirely new. You can see in these pictures the tubular filaments with the branches. They're branching off. That's their self-replication. They're creating new colonies. And you can also see in the bottom picture a little bud. That's the beginning of a new fiber. The territory of things on the scale of atoms and molecules is the nano world. Science has opened up the nano universe, where incredible new creations are possible. Nanotechnology explores materials that are less than a micron in size, or from 1 to 100 nanometers. And a nanometer is a billionth, 1/1000th of a meter. Nature and biology continually work on the nanoscale, assembling proteins and building with crystals to conduct the business of life. Spider webs are an example of that. Very fine filaments with enormous strength and flexibility because they contain nanoscale crystals. So let's go back to the filaments and the structures they contain, these ones that Clifford Carnicom has found. In those unidentifiable filaments, he has observed the formation of red blood cells and submicron-sized structures. So now you've got a filament making its own red blood cells. The engineered cells, the red blood, very, very tough, withstanding excesses of heat and chemicals, indicating that they are designed to endure almost anything. He has put them in a Bunsen flame, he has poured bleach on them, acid, and they still endure. In addition, they are able to replicate, growing outside of the body in a petri dish. This is highly sophisticated technology going on by itself, not in a laboratory. So we're witnessing red blood growing outside, having nothing to do with the bone marrow, in a petri dish, in somebody's very low-level lab. Could it be that artificial materials are being introduced into living things? Here you have, this comes from the nanotech industry. It's what I call the nanotech pyramid. You start with materials, you go up to structures, processes, and devices. Could it be that artificial materials are being introduced into us to create new processes from the ground up, which processes will override our own natural biology, our own internal systems? People with advanced Morgellons syndrome started with fibers coming out of their skin, and they're now observing very strange crystalline forms and metallic devices. The fibers became multicolored, and now they were accompanied by plaques, strange, hard little, almost like shards. People say they're like glass, and they're colored. The lesions keep emitting these things. They don't heal over or close, sometimes for years. Here are more plaque structures, even grooved metallic devices. On the right, you'll see one device, the front and the back. These images are supplied by Jan Smith of MorgellonsExposed.com, who has done extensive research on biotech websites, looking for things that match what comes out of her body, and she's finding them. The fibers from her skin were from high-density polyethylene. And I'm going to read what she's written on her website. The bizarre nature of my findings suggests a man-made source. It occurred to me that if these pathogens were being bioengineered in a lab, they were made of multiple components. The mutated material might reproduce and intermittently send out a batch of identifiable debris, much like the original genetics. I call this type of debris throwbacks. It's her theory that when new life forms are made through this gene splicing and mutation, bioengineering and nanotechnology, they will self-replicate in all kinds of ways, creating different mutations in each generation. Morgellons specimens can sometimes be identified with the original spores before those mutations occurred. Jan found 3 varieties of something called Omycota fungus in her specimens, as well as something else called Dictyostelium discoideum, which is a slime mold that is a major player in biomedical research today. The material coming from her body was ribbony and motile. It was grooved and oval, very much like the Omycota spore you see here. At the bottom, where the purple arrow from the bottom is it's a diagram of Omycota. And on the upper right, you see something that came out of Jan's body that looks exactly like Omycota. The fiber strands that you see here were made of cellulose and GNA. GNA is glucans polysaccharide sugars, and this was confirmed by microscopy. GNA is a synthetic cousin of DNA. It has a 3-carbon glycerol sugar in it instead of the 5-carbon that you find in DNA. Here's a news report from April 2008 in which we are told, big headlines, GNA is DNA's chemical cousin. It's a nanotechnology building block. The Biodesign Institute at Arizona State develops the first self-assembled nanostructures composed entirely of GNA, synthetic analog of DNA. The nanostructures contain additional properties not found in DNA, including the ability to form mirror image structures. An NIH article from Japan, on research from Japan, also tells us that various conductive polymers and gold nanoparticles are entrapped within the helical superstructure of this GNA. Now, the particular sugar found in this GNA is called beta-1,3-glucans. And here you see it under what's called a Raman spectroscope, very sophisticated equipment. It looks, the microscopist who looked at this called it a sugar snake. So this is the GNA that you're looking at. When Jan's fibers were put to a high heat flame, they released what she calls a gold payload. So they dropped out this tiny little bead of gold. And here's more. The fibers that contain a head, she calls it a golden head, orbs, and they all have this payload in them. The piezoelectric effect is the internal generation of a voltage when an outside pressure is applied, and vice versa. You can Google the piezo effect. The piezo effect occurs in crystals, ceramics, DNA, and certain proteins. So an example is, when you put a frequency to a crystal, it generates a voltage. And when you put a voltage to a crystal, it responds with a frequency. We call this piezoelectricity, electricity resulting from applied compression or frequency. Recent work by Clifford Carnicom reveals that a filament culture subjected to a blue light frequency, that's 375 nanometers, resulted in explosive growth of the culture within 24 hours after the initial incubation. So he put the blue light on, incubated it for 5 to 7 days, and then it exploded into all those little fibers that you see. We now live in a frequency-filled world. I don't have time to address HAARP, artificial weather, and the enormous spread of unnatural frequencies that are affecting the Earth today, but I will say this. I came across a very well-known paper on electromagnetic fields and neurological function, written by Professor Ross Adey, Loma Linda School of Medicine, with the subtitle, A Possible Paradigm Shift in Biology. We learn that the Earth's own natural magnetic field peaks, that means peaks, top, at 32 hertz. And that only happens in certain equatorial thunderstorms. The electronics we use today generate electromagnetic fields that are tremendous in the megahertz and gigahertz, million hertz and billion hertz range. So here you can see Earth and nature up at the top, 3 to 30 hertz. You can see HAARP has a low range. Then you see the Gwen towers, that's ground wave emergency network, the blue. HAARP again has another range right after that. Gwen has another range after that. And look at the phones and internet. We're talking about million hertz and billion hertz. Professor Adey reminds us that chemical bonds are magnetic bonds formed between atoms by paired electrons with opposite spins that are attracted magnetically. So if nature itself moves in the 3 to 30 hertz range, What is happening to us on the biochemical level with all the different frequencies our bodies are experiencing? What is being done to our biology? Again, I'll repeat Ross 80's little tenet here. Chemical bonds are magnetic bonds. Electromagnetism is capable of changing what is happening in our bodies. Frequencies are capable of supplying to the synthetic materials in our bodies the force or power that activates them, gets them working, makes them come alive. Nothing about us today is normal. We have hair that glows and skin that shimmers. This is from a healthy woman in Oregon who's been doing microscopy. And if you go to Mike and Jennifer's table, they can demonstrate some of this iridescent effect for you. Here is a glowing little arrow-shaped thing found in rainwater when the same woman who supplied the former previous images, was scanning. She was scanning water from a puddle under her microscope, and she saw this arrow-shaped thing that glowed. And here's a hexagon that grew a fiber in 20 seconds as it was being observed under the microscope. The field of synthetic biology is a new frontier of science. It draws from biochemistry and biomedicine, genetics, robotics, radiation biology, and information technologies. Using nanotechnology, its goals are to improve and transcend the limits of nature. On February 21st of this year, Time magazine had a feature story on the singularity, the term signifying the merging of man with machine. The story was released on Valentine's Day, February 14th, to underscore a love affair, the marriage of humanity and technology. The article tells us that a transformation is coming, and our species, Homo sapien, will no longer be recognizable as itself. We will be something new, something better. The time predicted for this transformation is 2045.